Thank you so much for being here. I'm Nichole DeMent, the Executive Director of SOLA, and I'm super excited for this community call this evening. I thank Robin Arnitz, our Deputy Director, for helping us and letting everybody in. Thank
That
you.
was
And of course, I am
my
very
name is
excited.
David Sinclair.
Yeah, I do still hear some background noise. Thank you very much for muting. If you have questions during this event, we have a lot to go over with our esteemed guest, Patterson Sims, today. But we do want to, as much as possible, include your questions. So if you could use the chat and feel free to put any questions in the chat, then we will try our best to answer them towards the end. And Robin will be watching that for us. Thank you again. So I am Nichole DeMent, the Executive Director of SOLA. I welcome you to this community call on March 10th, 2025. It's been an interesting year so far for SOLA, for all of us, hasn't it? And there's no better time than this moment to think about legacy. And it's a topic that we are deeply enmeshed in right now. And I think all artists should be. So, actually, as you may or may not know, Jenny Ruffner is the founder of SOLA. And Jenny passed away in January, and her spirit is here to guide us this evening because this was her idea. She is a longtime friend of Patterson and has worked together. They've known each other. And she said sometime last year, we have to get Patterson on. It would be so beneficial for our group and for everyone on the call. And as you will see tonight, that is definitely the case. So we thank her continually for everything that she set up for us to know and to do together tonight and always. And so I am thrilled to have you join us for today's conversation, where we'll get some valuable insights from our esteemed guest, Patterson Sims. And if you are looking to enhance your visibility, to secure institutional support, or maybe build a lasting legacy, you're in the right place for this community call. Patterson Sims is a highly respected curator, writer, and consultant with an incredible career spanning over 5 decades in the art world. His journey began in 1969 at OK Harris Works of Art in New York, and from there, he held major curatorial leadership roles at some of the country's most influential museums, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Seattle Art Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and as director of the Montclair Art Museum. Now based in New York City, Patterson plays a vital role in shaping how artists and their legacies are supported through foundations. He is the managing director of the Saul Steinberg Foundation, president of the Leon Polk Smith Foundation, and serves on the boards of several artist-endowed foundations, including the Woodman Family Foundation. And he's also deeply involved with the Independent Curators International, where he served as president and now co-chair of the board of trustees. I believe that's right, Patterson, but you can update anything I've missed. And we're just so thankful for your deep institutional knowledge that you bring tonight and this firsthand experience with artists and museums. This is beyond valuable for us. So thank you so much. We're looking forward to our conversation. Welcome, Patterson.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you have so much that you're bringing to us tonight. And, we understand legacy to some extent. Most of our artists are well on their way to creating something that is beneficial for them and for others in their legacies. But can we pull back just a little bit and give us a brief overview of trusts and artist-endowed foundations?
Well, every artist reaches a certain point in their life
towards the end of their lives when they're a bit older or whatever, where they have a fairly large body of work. It's pretty rare for an artist to have been able to sell all the work they made. And in fact, if it did happen, that would maybe be the best thing for the artist, effectively, because there'd be no way for that art to be spread to a wider audience. But so the two foundations that I'm involved with, Saul Steinberg Foundation and Leon Polk Smith, both of them left a bit of money. In the case of Saul Steinberg, about $250,000 when he died in 1999. That was completely insufficient, as it really turned out, because he made hundreds of works, Max, actually closer to thousands of works, somewhere between seven.
Yeah, yep. Be well, be well. All right.
We'll hope these people will get off. But in any event, so he left a lot of unsold work. A big group of things were given to the Beinecke Library, which is the great research library at Yale University. Another group of works were retained by the foundation, and they've become both say saleable items, but at the same time, we donate works. So his work is now in about 150 public collections. And we've looked, Seattle Art Museum, other institutions have his work now that we've donated to them. And it was a way of really spreading his work into a wider world. In the case of Leon Polk Smith, he didn't make the small, intimate drawings, which were the core of Steinberg's creativity. He made large paintings, geometric abstract paintings, and paintings which are very hard to place effectively because they're really bigger than most people's private houses and spaces might be able to encompass. So consequently, we've had an interesting time working with different galleries and placing works that way, and also working on having exhibitions because you want to have the work continue to be shown after you die. And so in the trusts and the foundations, trusts are usually set up by people who have work that they need to preserve, but at the same time, they may not have the resource to be able to start and to function in a foundation format. So the foundation formats, I would say, I know this is going to sound alarming, but they would need to be at least $1 million or $2 million to be able to set it up properly because you have to hire people, you have to find storage spaces, you have to pay insurance, you have to work on obviously getting the data for the works manifested. So consequently, that's the trust is one way to go. It all depends on one's individual creativity, but that allows the works to exist and not get into the tax system. Because if, let's say, an artist leaves 100 works behind and they're worth $1,000 each, they have to pay that amount in tax unless they've really done some pre-thinking on it. And that's why, as kind of complicated as it sometimes can get, you really need a lawyer,
Hmm.
and she or he has to be a person who can work with you to figure out, and they know enough about art. They've done this kind of transaction before. But I do strongly recommend it because otherwise it gets inherited by the niece. And the niece was very interested in the work, but she was married to an artist. And so she was thinking about that person's work first or whatever. I mean, there are all these kinds of personal situations, but effectively, you really have to be careful who you entrust with it, who you make the trustees of the organization. And they have to be balanced. There has to be one person who may not know that much about art, but they know a lot about public relations. There may be another instance where the person knows a great deal about art, but in a certain sense that can take over. And the chemistry of these small groups of people, the trustee groups, is a very key issue. And that chemistry it has to really be thought through very, very carefully. And the other issue is people pick their contemporaries in many cases, or people who are a bit younger. But by the time it becomes an estate, those people may be gone, or they may not be functioning at the highest levels that you want. So ideally, you find a younger person who really cared about your work. Maybe that was the person who was the studio assistant, and over the years, they evolved a closer and closer relationship to understanding the body of work and making sure that it was important enough for them so that they would really devote energy and thought to making that group of works as viable as possible. And so those are some of the issues that I think are out there. But please feel free to ask me more specific
Yeah.
questions if I haven't covered anything. And the
Oh,
image
there's
that I'm
so
seeing
much
on
to ask.
the image that okay, it's gone to you now, but the image that I'm seeing on the screen is a group of sculptures. So there's,
Um,
there's somebody who was having a kind of conversation before,
oh
and
yeah.
now we're
I I think we see you. So,
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, maybe they actually seeing the sculpture would be even nicer. I don't know. Is there?
well, we're seeing you. We're good there. So just to encapsulate what you said, trusts are for the individual artist that doesn't necessarily have $1 million or $2 million. That would be essential for an artist-endowed foundation. And we can maybe dig into that just a little bit more, but that's
And all of this is done in consultation with a lawyer,
yeah,
because it's complicated basically, and the tax implications can be quite challenging if you haven't really thought it through before. And
yeah,
you may want to leave bequests of your works. And other things that artists are very keen on. And Steinberg is an example of that. Is he wanted a group of works to go to Yale and to the Beinecke Library there. He had a great friend who was a professor at Yale, and so a lot of work was left there. It's an interesting repository, that Beinecke Library. It's one of the great libraries and resources for library and archival material in the world, but it's a little bit hard to sometimes get them to be persuaded to lend the work that's there. They feel very, understandably,
yeah,
um, they feel understandably very responsible. But so if you're trying to do a show and you're looking for resources there, oftentimes it's very hard to do it. So you want to make sure whatever relationship you develop, the U has an incredible library, of course. And so
yes,
maybe people's papers go there, because the papers and the archival materials are the other thing you need to be somewhat conscious of. You need to go through it. The other advice that I would have is, if you can, as an artist, as you're realizing you're kind of at a later stage in your career, assess your work and really, honestly, I would say, give it up, so, burn it, whatever you need to do, if it's not as strong as it should be, because it's going to be there and it's going to pull down. The bad pulls down the good. The good doesn't pull up the bad. And
mm,
so as a result, there are these, numerous studies that were made. And they may not even be something that you would want to have anybody else look at. So try to make a good effort before you die to catalog all of your works, put it into a database system, and then to also make sure if there's something that isn't so strong for you. And you can have I mean, I was involved with a trust that landed for that lasted for 7 years. And that person had a fellow artist that she was a woman artist friend she was very close to, and she gave that person the right to make the right to make decisions about what should be destroyed. There was a lot of early work there. She said, I can't be objective about it, but she felt her friend could do it. And then the works were taken away and the works were burned, actually, because they simply, felt that this was not going to represent her work well. There was a great deal of her work that was retained, and I think they made wise decisions. But that was the foundation that truly didn't have enough resource to be able to stay open beyond about 7 years. And so a smaller group of us, 3 or 4 of us, are still involved with it in a different way. But a niece and a sister-in-law were able to rise there, an aunt were able to rise to the occasion. And again, something like that doesn't become entirely clear at the moment that the decisions had to be made. So one has to figure out a way to have some flexibility, um, function in this way. And that's definitely what happened here, that the aunt thought that her husband, who was the actual biological uncle of this person, she thought her husband was going to be great. Well, her husband unfortunately died about 2 years after the artist died. And suddenly she was thrown into the situation. And she's a really terrific person, but then she remarried, and her husband wasn't as involved as her previous husband was. So, there's a lot of drama in the whole thing, and there's a lot of sort of interpersonal relationships that have to be thought through as carefully as one can.
it is so complex. And so, I'm glad that you brought up the drama. You've known a little bit of, I mean, I want to talk about fool's gold, but it might be off subject here. I mean, when you're talking about what to save, what to throw away, and the artist's interpretation of what is good, um, let's just maybe think in the lines of like major museums and collections. How do museum acquisitions work for artists who are not widely collected and are
I have
under
to say, honestly, they don't work.
okay.
It'd be very hard to persuade a museum that has never shown interest in an artist to show interest in the artist right away. Now,
Mhm.
maybe 8 years from then, when they suddenly realized the person was a neo-expressionist, before it was fashionable or whatever, then the attitude really does shift. But you
Mhm.
have to figure out how you're going to last in that bridge period. But the other issue is if you do have collectors who like your work, if a collector is important at a museum, the museum will try to make every effort they can to say when they've been offered work by this collector, gee, we want that. We never really got that involved with the artist during her lifetime, but really she was doing really good work, and we can see that now. So if a collector likes your work, that's a very good thing.
Yeah.
Remember, there's so many sort of famous artists in the world in this particular moment, and we're in a moment when artists are really compensated. Artists who, for whatever reason, attract a market are really compensated. That community of artists is going to be is basically knocking out the sort of lower level of artist who could be a really good artist. But in point of fact, is the artist may know, I've made these 4 or 5 key paintings. They were the paintings that moved me to the next chapter of my artistic creativity. And so they could do a situation where they could offer that work as a potential gift to a museum. And I mean, it's museums can't really buy things. I mean, they don't have the resource to buy things, basically. And they might for a younger artist, but then, a lot of people don't take art seriously unless it's expensive. So
Mhm.
there's that other kind of issue at play there, which is really exasperating, but it definitely is true. I mean, people, honestly, sometimes if we have a Steinberg drawing at 35,000, we'd be probably better to put it at 55,000 because the people who would buy the work would take it more seriously. I mean, it's collectors are sometimes middle class people, but we have so many art schools, but none of the art schools teach people how to be collectors and
Mhm.
encourage people to be collectors. So the number of collectors, the number of active participants in wanting to own work and have work is so small in relation to the number of people who make work and the amount of work those people make. It's
Mhm.
not like certain other fields where you know people who love football can play football. I mean, it's really frustrating that way because these artists we've really made, very serious good work. It's going to be hard for that work to show up. Now, it doesn't mean that you can be, you're not going to, if you're not famous when you die, you're not going to be famous. Because look, Van Gogh, Bach, Emily Dickinson, these were all people who had, very little interest shown in their work when they were alive, but huge work later. De Kooning didn't have his first show until he was 45. So it's not unusual to have. I mean, he happened to live into his 90s. So in other words, 45 he was in the middle of his life, not at the end of his life. But I do think, I mean, for instance, there's an artist like Carmen Herrera. I don't know whether people know her work, but she was Cuban American, lived in Paris for a long time. And she was actually a friend of this artist, Leon Polk Smith. And she really, it was interesting because at the end of her life, and when she was in her hundreds, she lived to be 106, I believe. In any event, at the end of her life, she said to her fancy gallery, Listen, which is a gallery based in New York, in London, and in Asia. She said to her gallery, there's a really good artist that maybe you should think about, Leon Polk Smith. And there's no question that that artist who we wanted to place in that gallery would never have gotten to that gallery if we had pressed the case. But once this very successful artist, Carmen, spoke to the quality of his work and said that she really would feel very comfortable if he was shown in the gallery. The whole situation really changed. And that's another thing to remember that if you have a friend who's a good artist and she or he is in a good gallery, that is a person who can be an advocate for you. Because if an artist is doing well in a gallery, the gallery wants to please that person. They want to do things that are going to make the person feel important. And so I certainly have seen that in the case of Carmen Herrera's work. She's been responsible for getting certain people in the gallery who the gallery wouldn't have taken as seriously if she didn't take them seriously. So if you have a friend who's had success, see if you can use it for your own success. I mean, and your friends, if they're close friends, they will help you. But that's something that has moved many of the dealers that I know and art gallerists. They really, if somebody is in the circle, in the close circle of somebody who they show and admire and are doing well with, make sales with, they're going to listen to that person's advice.
That's great. Our networks are very, very important. So I think it's really interesting that you are sharing with us that, museums are important, and yet if you aren't engaging with one before you pass, they likely won't engage unless there's other factors involved, but it's not as likely. So what are the best ways to safeguard an artist's legacy? Is it archives, foundations? What are some things that artists can start doing now that,
Artists have sort of found their own foundations. There may develop, and they may have already evolved in a city as forward-thinking as Seattle, but there may be clusters of artist estates which are now handled by a particular entity, a company, maybe even with charging for that. I think there are things a little bit like that in New York, but artists have individual careers and they have different, very different needs. The sculptor has to have much bigger storage space than the artist who made prints the primary part of their creativity. So I would say that the best thing to do is to have a really good record of all the work that you made. And if there's work that you made that was really good, that you can't find it, put that in the record as well, because it'll be found eventually. I mean, it'll show up. Somebody 5 years later will say, "Oh, I found this work. Is there any chance that's the same artist that has this foundation or has this entity?" So, in other words, if you can make those connections early on, it's really important to do. Get your work cataloged. It's an arduous process. It's not something the artist maybe is the best person to do themselves because it takes them backward when they want to go forward. Artists are thinking about the work they're making now and the work they will be making. It's not that they dislike the work they've made before, but they've made it. It's done. They're moving on to the next thing in a very important and valuable way. So I guess I would say try to find that entity that would be interested in your work. If you have certain works that you think are key, or if there's a particular curator who's liked your work, one of the verities of the curator situation is just a general professional issue. That curator who did a great job. I mean, I worked at the Seattle Art Museum for, I guess, 11 years. The person before me maybe was 5 years. The person after me was 5 years. I mean, these careers, they go on. And I'm lucky that I've had, been able to make some ongoing connections with people. But effectively, that curator moves to the next museum. She or he at the next museum finds a group of local artists that they really like a lot. And they remember the local artists that they liked in their previous job. It is very hard to place them. I'm a huge fan of Jeffrey Mitchell. He's just one of my favorite artists, eternally, basically. And over the years, one way or another, we got a lot of his works and really have enjoyed it tremendously. But what I'm saying is he's now in Portland. He was out in the East for a while. So in other words, even the loyalties that people had from the first institution they were involved with, they're gone now in most cases. And then you have people like myself who are long retired, basically. I'm not an active curator working in a museum. I'm in my late 70s. And so as a result, it just isn't going to be, I'm not going to have much clout at that institution. And again, the next person has come, follows you, and very frequently this happens with museum directors constantly. It's like the next person arrives as a museum director. Oh my God, this place is in such a mess. This would never last. I don't know how I'm going to be able to bring this place that's so disastrous back to reality again. And it happens, I've seen it happen so many times with the arrogance of these individuals who think the people who were there before were terrible, did a terrible job. And in some cases, they did leave. They were incredible fundraisers and incredible edifice builders. So they made a big extension on the museum and they raised a lot of money, but there was maybe 5 or 6 million was missing. So how are we going to, get the 5 or 6 million? It's really hard because you're getting it for a project that has been done effectively. There are a lot of bond issues that get created for museums to build things, and the bond issue has to be paid off eventually. And the people who are holding a bond, they just could charge more interest or whatever. I mean, it's a difficult situation because these institutions, even the very biggest of these institutions, is underfunded. I
Yeah.
mean, just today there was an article on hyperallergic about, the Brooklyn Museum. And, this is a venerable, incredible museum in the what is considered to be the coolest borough in New York City. But it doesn't mean actually that their finances are that good. I mean, they have a $10 million deficit this year. How are they going to pay that? If they don't pay it, it's going to be held. So they have a $4 million deficit as they're moving into their next year, which will have a $6 million deficit. I mean, you realize how incredibly taxed these institutions are because they simply don't have the resource they need. And half of the cost of all these institutions is the payroll costs. And they just, they have no way of raising more money for payroll. They're not going to get a named position in the office of the registrar or whatever. I mean, in other words, you can get a name position for your director, and she or he can, be happy that their part of the operation is being paid for. But there's lots of other parts of the operation, so that's difficult. But anyway, so there's relationships that can be formed with curators. That curator can be a person who helps you as they move on to other institutions, and that I think definitely can happen. And
Mm,
there's also the notion that you you give something to the museum, you leave in your will or whatever. And so the museum will have to at least consider that at that point. You want to cover yourself because then it goes back into the estate if the museum isn't interested. But you have to think that really it's going to be very rare for very, very rare for artists to sell things to museums at at their retail cost because it just the money isn't there. It just isn't there. I mean, we now are just apparently exiting a period when we were looking at women, we were looking at people who were gay, we were looking at trans people, we were looking at people of color. That seems to be diminishing. That
mm,
was a real funding source because people said, this is a group of people who have really been overlooked. And
mm,
so one was able to raise money for that.
mm,
But now with the new administration, that that possibility of the of of acquisitions that are made with this real motivation because they were communities of people who were neglected, who were their backs were turned to them, and now we're looking and saying this is fabulous work. How are we going to get it? Basically.
mm, You bring up some really good points, Patterson. Um, I'm interested in this conversation around museums, and it seems there's a shift. We are digressing from our topics here, which I'm open to the conversation. But as we move and things shift in museums due to funding and lack of funding, maybe gallery models also are shifting. What is the new model? Where are we going? What's
Well,
your
it's kind of like, to me, it's the big and the small. They're these huge monolithic galleries that represent 80 artists and are located in 5 different continents. I mean, they're just these amazing mega galleries. I mean, a lot of them are based in New York, but a lot of them are based in Switzerland or in Austria or different countries in the world, obviously in Asia as well. They're great galleries that now have been formed and are really operating well in Korea. But so
Mm,
they can help. Those kinds
mm,
of galleries can help. But
mm,
again, they're not for making discoveries.
mm,
They're more about pillaging than supporting the person from the very beginning. And you can't blame them because they have a lot of tremendously successful artists.
mm,
So the idea that they're going to actually bring an artist into the fold who has had very little renown or success or economic response is unusual. It's not that it doesn't happen, it certainly happens, but it doesn't happen frequently enough to know that you could count on that. And again, these large galleries, they aren't operating out of Seattle. It's not as if Hauser and Wirth has a Seattle branch. They certainly are very aware of the collectors in Seattle,
mm,
and they know how to come and deal with those collectors. And maybe they'll stop in at a gallery when they're in town, but essentially they're not going to do that. Basically, they're here to make sales, and so they're taking images of works of art, high-res images of works of art, out to this collector, that collector. I won't name names, but they're well-known people in Seattle. There's an incredible group of collectors in Seattle, fantastically successful, and some of them are involved with getting the work of local artists. But it'd have to be Jake Lawrence. It would have to be gosh, I mean, other artists who've been, or Dale Chihuly. I mean, people who've had extraordinary success there. But effectively, there aren't that many artists who've broken through. Gary Hill is another example. But again, these are all people of my older generation. I'm hoping that there are people right now who are the Gary Hills or the Jake Lawrences or people who really have, for whatever reason, their work resonates very widely. And there are definitely other artists in Seattle like that. But effectively, it's going to be hard because, again, those big galleries, they suffer and they lay off 100, they lay off 50 people, not 50 people, they lay off 15 people from their staff of 100. But there are galleries in New York that have staffs of 100 people. I mean, it's just incredible,
mm,
really. I mean, I don't know how they operate basically, and I think they have trouble operating. What happens is they'll make a sale, they'll make a resale, they'll get a Picasso to sale, or they'll get extraordinary Diebenkorn or whatever the artist may be, or they'll get a great um, Joan Mitchell. But effectively, they're not really making it off sometimes the very artists that they're showing, but they're doing their what we call, we used to call backroom activity. They have a great work in the back room. They know that X collector is interested in that artist. And that if they can make that sale for sometimes multiple $1 million, it's going to really be the thing that keeps them going as opposed to a sale of 30 objects at the $10,000 level.
Such incredible insights. So there's so many complex backroom ideas that we're exploring here. I'm wondering for the artist that is creating work that is making an impact, maybe it's large installations, large pieces, it's social justice work.
Hmm.
How does someone gain visibility, create an income, and or maybe these are separate answers and separate questions, but how do they sustain their careers? The artist
Well,
that is
not
doing
as
what
the
they're
artists
doing.
have much choice. There's something in them that says, I want to make this work.
Mhm.
And it isn't often logical, it isn't often
Mhm.
practical, but it's
Mhm.
something that they feel really strongly about.
Yeah.
And so it's going to happen, basically. The idea is, can it get shown at the Henry? I mean, can it find its way out into the world? And maybe it'll happen at the Seattle Art Museum, but there's just the door of, contemporary artists is just a little bit narrower there than it might be at the Fry. So,
Mhm.
you've got institutions that are committed to, the newest set of ideas or whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think if somebody makes large installations, they've got to think it through because they have to realize at a certain point they're not going to have the space to have that large installation. And it's going to be hard to find somebody who wants to buy that large installation. And then, horror of horrors, that person decides 4 years later they want to sell it. And there's just nobody to buy it. And it's not that it's a bad object, it can be a wonderful object, but it
Mhm.
simply doesn't. I mean, Leon Polk Smith made one very large multi-part piece which we always thought this is the one that will sell for $1 million. Well, we showed it to this person, showed it to that person. It was a work that was made in the 60s. And so what are you going to do eventually? Well, finally, this interesting Swiss collector decided to buy it, but he did not want to pay $1 million. He wanted to pay many hundreds of thousands or several hundred thousands lower than that amount. But in the end, we decided, yes, this person should have it. I mean, the other issue is that there was like a Robert Irwin that was bought, excuse me, James Turrell that was bought by the Seattle Art Museum. And we owned the rights to make this for a long time. I never had the wherewithal to figure out how I would get someone to pay to make it installed. It was very stupid of me. It's something I really should have done. But then a person from Seattle moved east. They have a place in the country in the Catskill Mountains. And this guy, Bing Wright is his name. Bing decided it was important to get that piece there. And so, his mother, Jenny Wright, she was going to be helpful for this. And so now this large installation work, which has never been seen at the Seattle Art Museum, but it's owned by the Seattle Art Museum, is sitting in a little town called Livingston Manor in the Catskills of New York State. And it's beautiful. It looks fantastic. They also have some wonderful drawings as well, big drawings that have been made, commissioned. So in other words, there's a future for these objects in many ways, but the future sometimes takes a while to unfold, basically.
Mhm.
I mean, as I say, there's SOLA drawings there because the SOLA Foundation has this really, they have enough resource. It's the widow is still alive, an extraordinarily bright person. They have enough resource so they can be making transactions and doing long-term loans. I mean, at Mass MoCA, if anybody's been there, the wonderful space
Yeah.
in Massachusetts, at Mass MoCA, there's an incredible, retrospective of SOLA which is constantly on view because he gave a 25-year loan to them. But I'm now old enough, so that 25 years is coming up, basically. And so we'll see if they continue the loan, the long-term.
Mm.
I mean, it's just, or the Twombly's, take the Twombly space at the Menil in Houston. It's fabulous. It's just one of the greatest small museums in the world. But
Mm.
you really have to think it through, and you have to be like Cy Twombly was super successful. He was married to a very wealthy person.
Mm.
He honestly, he gave them Menil this fabulous group of things, basically. But not everybody will have the opportunity to give things away or be confident they'll stay on view.
So with that, what are some of the support networks that artists can work on right now?
You know, what's wonderful now is this, we're in the age of residencies. There's just incredible numbers of residencies. And I actually know a number of artists whose careers are moving from residency to residency.
Yeah.
And that's sort of paying for their life during that time. There's complications because who's paying the rent on the place that they're not living in while they're living in, a beautiful place in Tuscany and having the time of their lives drinking the best wine they've ever drunk. I mean, but the residencies are a real place now. I know I'm involved with the Family Foundation, as you mentioned earlier, and that's Betty Woodman, George Woodman, her husband, and their daughter Francesca. And now Charlie, the remaining member of that family, he has taken the house that Betty and George had in Tuscany, outside of Florence, and he's turned it into a residency program. I mean, residency programs are hard sometimes to get into, but if you kind of begin to scope out residencies, and there are lists of them, and there's, kind of databases where you can find information about them, but there are a huge number of them. I mean, Via Selmans has bought this huge house in Southampton, and so she's going to turn that over as artist residencies. Jasper Johns will probably do something like that on the property that he has in Sherman. And he's 94 or whatever. I mean, these things are happening now and happening in a major way. And look what Joan Mitchell has done. They've established a whole resource for artists housing and artist residency programs in New Orleans. She never, I know, as far as I know, she probably didn't even go to New Orleans. But the people who run that foundation said, well, this is a city that needs this kind of special situation, and we'll make it happen. We'll have a building. Rauschenberg has done that in Florida, Rauschenberg Foundation. So I think it's interesting to investigate those foundations because many of them have residency programs or they give grants. For instance, the Jasper Johns Foundation that he's really behind, but he doesn't, his name isn't on it, is the Foundation for Contemporary Arts. And they give grants of, I guess it's $5,000 to quite a few artists, and they have a whole new grant program. Because another one of the foundations I'm involved with, we want to maybe help fund it, basically. I mean, so the foundations and the artist foundations, they don't have to be convinced of the importance and power of art and artists. It's not like the National Endowment for the Arts. It's not like the U.S. government. These people are really, they made their work, they made their money out of art. They made their money and their joy in life was their friendships with artists or whatever, and the kind of bonds they had for all going to the same part of the world for their summer vacations or their sort of country house or whatever. And so many artists I know, it doesn't matter how wealthy they are, they have country places they go to. I mean, I'm always amazed by it. But they find an old farmhouse someplace, which is in 3 hours. It's the 3 hour situation. Within 3 hours of Manhattan, there's significant numbers of artist alternative places. And some of them will turn into residencies, I'm sure. I mean, but there are already enormous numbers of residencies. So I guess I would do that. And there's artist grant programs. I mean, they're there. They have to be researched. I wish I could say, oh, you have to just go to this website or here's the link. But they're there and they can be found and they are definitely worth pursuing. And, that's happening in Seattle. I mean, maybe it's happened more with writers than it's happened with visual arts people, but it's definitely happened. And it's definitely a thing that will grow, basically.
This is so much to unpack for everyone here, I'm sure. So I think that there's maybe a little more deep that a little deeper we can go as far as these building relationships. So we have grants, we have residencies, we have, how do we build relationships with institutions, organizations, curators that are
Well,
important to us?
it's there's a museum that's really quite close to a museum and community arts center that's really quite close to the Chicago University of Chicago in Chicago. And I'm just blanking on the name of it, but they do this program that I got involved with for a few years, where every Monday night, a community of artists would get together and show each other their work and then talk about their work. And it seemed like it was enormously successful. And the sense of camaraderie that came out of it was really important. So I think you're onto something with what you're doing, but maybe it's about the people who would sign up or might sign up for something like this, really meeting on Mondays. And you'd have to maybe bring somebody in from elsewhere, but maybe you wouldn't have to. Maybe it would actually be great. I mean, I don't know whether Katerina would do it. I'm pretty close to her, but I would imagine someone like Katerina Mancheva would probably be open to it. And I was you'd get 15 artists around. I mean, the artist would have to not be mean to the person. They'd have to, be respectful of the fact the person was willing to open themselves to them. Or you get a curator from the Portland Museum to come over
Mhm.
um, and then see your community. And then you see if they can do a trade and somebody can come from Seattle and do it. I mean, these are the ways that I think we build community. And it has to be built. It isn't going to happen spontaneously. It has to be controlled in some way. And so if Ginny's money could go to a situation where the number of people who would sign up would actually be seeing and sitting with each other and working with each other and then showing their art to each other. And then they could show their art and they could introduce the work of another artist they really like. That would be an interesting thing to do. I mean, I wish I'd done all these programs when I was at the Seattle Art Museum. I mean, I tried to bring people together, but um, nonetheless, I think that is a way that you make some of this happen because artists, there are there are too many artists to think that they're all going to be successful. I mean, the truth of it is, it's really hard. You can have success for maybe 10 years, and then it passes. And it's not that you're not doing a good job. It's not making you're not making good work. But then the next generation. It's kind of a youth feast that happens in the art world with collectors. And so, they're not going to say, oh, this is a wonderful 65-year-old painter. They're going to say, I want to see get somebody in their 20s. So I mean, it's,
Mhm.
but again, I would say in general, you have to treat being an artist and even being a curator as a calling, not a profession. You're called to this. You honestly have no choice.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, I had all the artists that would probably come to this event tonight. It isn't as if they could give it up, you know. It may be given up for them, but they would have trouble giving it up because it's a calling. I mean, they've been asked to do it. And
Yeah.
and the other thing to do, actually, that I didn't mention before, but I'll mention it now,
Yes.
is if you have certain people who've been important to you in your life as an artist, give them work. Let them have work. I mean, they're going to love it. And maybe they're going to give it to the niece or the nephew who doesn't love it. But essentially, I don't think art gets better by sitting in storeroom. And that's why I'm very happy with the decision that was made by the Sol Steinberg Foundation to give work away. I mean, they're now like 150 works, 150 museums. Maybe we've added 70 or so museums in the years that I work there. And they have things. And then they do shows. So we've just had a show close in Madrid at the Fondation Mag, excuse me, at the Fondation Juan March. And we've done a project in Paris that involved the Fondation Mag or the Mag Gallery. I mean, we've done these projects in different places. We've just given, I mean, it surprised me, but the Victoria and Albert Museum in London wanted 25 works by Steinberg. I mean, it was wonderful for us because their repositories, the New York Public Library took 200 works. So maybe some of these gifts can be made in terms of the wills that are written and some of the kind of conversations that you have. Because, I mean, one has got to find a way to protect these works. And of course, a storeroom is one way to do it. But I mean, art is not made to go in storage. It's made to be, I think. I mean, that seems the way what would be my perspective on it. So
Yeah.
giving things away, I think does make sense. Now, if you give it away and the person turns around and sells it, that's kind of annoying. But I mean, effectively, you're going to pick people who really believed in the work and who it's wonderful to be able to say, you supported Jenny while she was alive. We'd like to make sure that you get a work. Or is there a museum you'd like us to give a work to in honor of you? That would be a good way to kind of get all the various issues working together. So, such and such a collector, they like Jenny's work. They live in West Virginia, wherever they might live. And then so you get that person to give a work, by Jenny in her memory. And their own gift, basically. I mean, I think that you can't count on your work selling. And if you do count on it for selling, it can only sell for a while. It's not going to sell forever. I mean, I'm not that that hasn't happened. Obviously, there are artists who are tremendously successful, whose works continue to sell. George O'Keeffe, I mean, her work started selling when she was really early. But again, she was helped by the fact that she was married to an art dealer.
Mm.
That was definitely it made her very shrewd about her art. And at the same time, it gave her connections, which were incredible, basically. I mean, which put her in it allowed her to make it into the art market world faster than most of the artists, and certainly faster than many women artists have been able to.
Are there other women artists or maybe examples of other artists who gained more recognition later in life that you could share with us that you know
Well, I
aware
mean,
of?
there isn't. Have you ever heard of an artist named Forrest Bess? He was a Texas-based artist, and he's just shown at different galleries. And then someone like Carmen Herrera was later in life. Francesca Woodman was posthumously. Um, and that does happen. There definitely are artists dying can be one way to get people to pay attention to your work. It's a horrible but true
Yeah.
situation. So, and a violent death, I suppose, is even more intense. But
Oh,
so as a result, you have a situation where people pay attention and people realize the importance and rarity and the fact that it's ending. I mean, when an artist like Jean-Michel Basquiat dies,
mm,
he's still an extremely young man. I mean, there's a lot of work out there, but there's not as much work as there would have been if he'd lived,
yeah.
basically. He would have been
Right.
creating more and more work, basically. I mean, he was a wildly productive artist, luckily. But I don't really, I mean, ask your question again and maybe I'll give you a better answer.
I think you have given us some insights there, so I appreciate that. But the question was, are there artists who gained recognition later in life that you can think of examples?
Well, I've just named a couple of them,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
There probably are others. I mean, I'm just thinking,
sure.
well, like this, Jack Whitten's about to have a huge show at MoMA, I guess. And I mean, no, people did not pay that much attention to his work. I mean, there was an article about him in the show at the New York Times over the weekend. And I mean, I didn't know him well, but I knew him somewhat. And his wife, Mary, was a paper conservator who I had occasion to, take some drawings to be conserved. I mean, he was not super successful. He had people who were smart bought his work. There's no question about it. But I mean, he's having much more fame now. I mean, he's had a show at the Met of his sculptures. I mean, it's kind of incredible. It's wonderful that this attention being is paid. So it's not out of the question, but it's a rarity. But it's it's a rarity that happens.
Why do you think Jack Witt was one of the select ones right now?
Well, he just made very sincere and deep work.
Mm,
He happens to be black, so that's played a bit of a role in it, I'd say. And he happened to make large bodies of work. He made a whole series of sculptures, for instance, which nobody knew about. Nobody knew he made sculpture. So it was like uncovering this whole different part of him. And some of that is true in the career of someone like Francesca Woodman, that
mm,
no one knew the depth of her work, how much work she'd made. And for whatever reason, the combination of her suicide and the work that she made in this meteoric 5-year career of hers, that work really totally touched people. It just became, I mean, there was just a show in London that I went to see with Julia Margaret Cameron, the great 19th century um, English photographer. And people, could compare Francesca's work with the work of Julia Margaret Cameron. It was amazing to me. But I mean, in other words, people do look at work at different times in different ways.
mhm,
But the artist may not be able to experience that because the artist will be deceased at that point. So,
right.
that person doesn't get to see it, but maybe people who were close to them gets to see it. But
Yeah.
it argues for trying to preserve the work because it may become pertinent in a way. I'm seeing that happening with artists whose work from the 60s that I knew. And their work went into eclipse. They had a moment maybe in the 60s, but there were several decades that were really fallow. Well, it has changed. People are really looking at that work and really admiring it. And so you have to have faith in that. But
Mm,
again, you have to realize that it was a calling that you couldn't predict how successful you would be.
right.
Philip Guston didn't think he would be successful, and the very works that people loathe become the works that people feel are the strongest works that one makes. You
One of
know,
my favorites is Hilma af Klint.
exactly. Well, she structured it that way because she said, "I don't want my work shown for I believe that the period was 30,
Mm,
20
yeah.
years. It can't be shown until that time because people simply won't get it. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, you probably got to that show at the Guggenheim as well. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just fabulous work,
Yeah.
fabulous work. And
Huge. Well before her time. Yeah.
exactly, and
Yeah.
and really appreciate it. I mean, it really rewrites history basically when you have a work that's good.
Right. So if we have about 10 minutes left, I'm open for
Yep.
any questions in the chat, of course. I'm not sure if we have any just yet, but if we could talk a little bit more, I am always an advocate of archiving and short of burning the things you don't want, Patterson, can you
Right.
give us some insights on just how do we
The
structure
concept of
really?
archives that has sort of evolved in time, but also it's kind of involved in mind is don't throw anything out. It
Mm,
has pertinence. Throw out something that you feel would embarrass you or somebody else if it was given too much public attention. But effectively, keep it because it's all going to be pertinent in some way. People are going to say, "Oh, I now see the linkage between these notes that she was making in the 90s to the work that she was making at the end of her life
mhm,
in the 20s or 30s of this century." So, I mean, I think within reason, and there are places that the U has, taken a lot of archives of different people. I understand. I don't know that for a fact, but the U would be a great source has a potential source. And the archives of American art is the most famous place. But that it depends on the artist. I mean, maybe Gary Hill should go to the archives at the Getty because the Getty has an amazing archive center. But I think it'd be unlikely if an artist who hadn't achieved much success in Seattle or wherever was going to offer the works to the Getty and the Getty would take them. I don't know how they work, but I doubt that. And as I say, even if it's something gets into the archives, like the archives at Yale, the so-called Beinecke Library and Archives, it's a little upsetting because it just they're reluctant to loan it. They feel tremendous proprietary control over the object, and they
mhm,
want to keep it safe. So that it won't be safe if they lend it too often, too frequently. But
mhm,
there are different institutions. If there was a time when you had a show at X museum in California, it's perfectly valid to write them again and say, I had a show. It was very meaningful for me. Would you be interested in these 5 drawings or these 2 paintings or this sculpture? That was a turning point in my career, and I would like to reward you effectively for
mhm,
having a staff at that time because the staff will not be there 10 years later. I mean, they just aren't there. I mean, it's not that there aren't some curators who stay. I mean, there's a marvelous curator of prints um, at the Art Institute of Chicago, who have worked with for some different things. He's made a big commitment. He's willing to stay there. But most people have different kinds of ambitions. And the only way in many professions, but certainly in terms of museum work, the only way you get a big raise is to get a new job.
mhm.
Because
Yeah.
look at the labor disputes that they're having in museum after museum. Museums unionize the museum really doesn't feel that the people don't feel that they're being paid properly. And they're
Mhm,
probably right, but it's not as if the museum has extraordinary resources of money. What is disturbing to me is how much museum directors are paid often, because they're
mhm,
paid, astronomical amounts of money. And when other people take a salary cut, quite frequently you'll read that the salary cut was not taken by the people at the top of the organization. And I think if you make salary cuts, it's got to be across the boards.
yeah. I think we do have a question. Robin, can you?
Yes, Rosette is asking what archive online is best to go with the physical archive? Any suggestions?
Well, effectively, people do catalog raisonnés, which is kind of the next stage when you've done a listing of all your works. They do catalog raisonnés in both online formats, and they're still doing them in printed formats because people still like to get the information in a printed form. They like to switch between pages as opposed to switch between parts of the site. So I would say you have to make sure that all the data basically that you're keeping, it's all online. You don't want it to be in any other kind of format, basically, and a readable system, a system that you can tell somebody else who's working on a show of that artist's work in Philadelphia. Here's how you access the website, and here are the levels of the website. We're not going to show you what the conservation record is. Maybe we're not going to show you that it was bought in at auction, but here's the other information that we can show you. Is that the question, or am I not getting it right? Or the person who had the question, you should just ask it if you have audio.
Yeah. Yes, please. So are you saying that so I have a physical archive which I'm working on, but it seems to me that setting up a digital one is very convenient, either on a website or there are specialized websites that do archiving. I just wondered if you had any that you prefer to use if you're doing early research or any
Well, the
suggestions.
one that we've used for the distributions on is called Collectors Systems. It's based in New York City, Collector Systems.
Okay.
I have to believe if you made some inquiries in Seattle, you'd find somebody. I mean, I'd call Greg Casera Gallery, I'd call the other successful galleries in Seattle and saying, what do you use as your database? What is the system that you use? We're switching from
Great suggestion. Great. Yeah.
we're switching from one entity, Collector Systems, to another one that has much more capability of dealing with a semi-catalog raisonné. Catalog raisonnés are really hard to do if the person has any degree of productivity and has had a long career. It's really hard to do. But so you want a system that knows it's not going to be complete and it's going to be complete in time. And you want to pass that down to the people who are running your trust or foundation so that they're going to say, oh, wow, there was this show that she had, the beginning of her career, and it was when she was still living in Chicago, and we've just gotten the data for it, and you want to add that in. You want to just make it as complete as it can be. But
Uh, go ahead.
people still like printed versions of that. But making a book is an expensive proposition. So what you could do is you could make your site and then decide, oh, these are as I go through now, I realize these are the 26 paintings that really meant a lot to me in my career. Maybe I'll make a little booklet out of them. And now, again, because these kinds of self-made books are not that expensive, basically, Apple Books, etc. You could make a little book of what you felt the highlights were. And then, picking up on something that I didn't talk about before, you're working on it right now. Make notes about the works that you're putting into the system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
System, I thought I was going to only go in this direction. The more you write down, because to me, and I mean, art history is written by art historians, and I'm not really an art historian. To me, the most important thing is what the artist felt about his work. I mean, that's the most important thing, basically. That's the thing that's going to transcend time, because so many people, as they write about work, are writing it from their own time's perspective, and their own time's perspective is not going to be the time of the person who wants that data later.
That's so helpful. Okay,
Thank
we are
you.
just a couple minutes from time,
Thank
so
you
I
very
would.
much. Good to see you again. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming, Patterson.
Very easy. All I have to do is sit in my own little office. Rosette.
We appreciate your sitting in your office and sharing your insights with us. I do see one more question that just came in. Robin, do you want to share that question with us? And then that'll be
Yeah.
our last one.
So this is, I believe, from Kathleen, saying regarding museums purchasing artwork, I am pleased to say that the Museum of Northwest Art through the Collectors Club purchases one artwork from Northwest Artist annually. Yay! Also, if you're considering donating your work to a museum as a promised gift, please put it in your will.
That's all very
Great.
good. I have one question for the group who's left. Have
Yes,
any of you gotten one of these $5,000 gifts?
the SOLA Award.
Yeah. Anybody in your group there?
Yes.
Okay, will you tell us how it's affected you? How is it, what has it done for you? What is it? Is it change things? Is it confirm things? I mean, this was a wonderful thing that happened to you. What was the reaction?
I'm just looking at our list. We have Joan Stewart Ross and Nori Sato.
Nori could say, what did it mean to you, Nori, to get this, and how did you use it? I'm bringing out the shy part of me. There you
Sorry. Well, for me, what was very valuable about it was that it came at a time when I was at the end of building my studio. And you know how it is, you spend all your money, but then you still need like lights and light fixtures. And so I was able to use that to purchase light fixtures, sort of better lighting system for my studio, which has really, really helped me in terms of
Yeah.
being able to produce it. It didn't go into career items necessarily, but obviously making work is part of that whole system. So
Well, I'm glad you got the award.
thank you.
And you can see in your studio, otherwise it would be pitch black.
I know it would be.
Little lamp.
Joan, do you have any feedback for us?
Well, yes, it's kind of funny because I had a very similar use of my SOLA award in that it paid for the roof of our storage shed where I have my second studio down on the Long Beach Peninsula in Southwest Washington on the Willapa Bay. And the storage unit, which is a teeny little cedar building that's, oh, I don't know, 70 years old or so, maybe even as old as I am, needed a roof. And that SOLA award paid for that roof so that those tools and all of the things that I store and my husband stores in there are going to be dry because it does rain 10 months a year down there. So it's kind of a utilitarian, functional, just right at the right time. And it came so that it supported my work in my studio, which is about 10 feet away. So, I think that the award just came serendipitously to probably a lot of us because we really need to keep things in good shape to do our work. And that's what's really important, is to keep us safe and to not, get holes in our roofs, and to have all of our tools and utilities kept safe too. So yeah, thank you again. It's been a great award.
Thank you,
You-
Joan.
so that-
The SOLA award application is out now. So I encourage anyone who is interested in applying to do so through the Artist Trust website. So artisttrust.org, SOLA award, it'll be coming up in a newsletter if you don't have it, and that's probably not it. So I encourage you to apply because this kind of networking is what we continue to do in addition to the videos that we create, the brief bio videos that we create for each artist so that their story can continue. And we are here to advocate for you as a woman that has dedicated 25 years or more. And I hope to see many of you applying this year. So with that, Patterson Sims, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you everyone on the call. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Joan and Nori, for chiming in with your feedback, useful as ever. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night to you, and thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.